Welcome, dear friends. This would be an interesting introduction to Indian democracy and the Constitution of India. In the first lecture of this series, I am going to take you to a tour, a global tour of the right to vote movement. It is also called as the suffrage movement, and right to vote is considered to be a vital right in strengthening the democracies of around the world. Though our discussion, the discussions which we will be having in the future, would be concentrating more on the Indian democracy within the framework of Constitution of India. I thought that it is a great idea to take into consideration why the right to vote was given to different citizens of different parts of the world. So I would be focusing my attention on three important developed countries, namely France, the United States of America, and United Kingdom, especially their efforts to grant their citizens the right to vote, and then compare it with the Indian context. Why is it important to understand how this right to vote evolved in this? Because democracy's the foundation is voting. One can vote their government, vote to the power the government whom they consider to be fit to govern themselves. So I consider that for strengthening political democracy, people, irrespective of their status in the society, if they were to get the right to vote, that obviously would translate into strengthening the democracy. So let us look into the right to vote movement and what it achieved for Indians and for the citizens around the world. At the outset, let me tell you that when you talk about Indian democracy, we basically are restricting our discussion to the recent history of Indian movement. That is, we would say that India was a colony of Britishers and it became independent from the British rule because of the legacy of the freedom struggle. And ultimately on 15th August 1947, this country, that is India, adopted democracy and independence was granted. Obviously, independence didn't come all of a sudden. It has to be fought, and many people lost their lives fighting for this Indian independence. And also, the parliamentary form of democracy, especially the Constitution of India, was not granted all of the sudden. It also evolved, as we will be seeing in the future lectures. It also evolved during the course of freedom struggle and by studying the constitutions of the different countries. As of now, we have adopted the parliamentary form of democracy, and this parliamentary form of democracy was adopted on 26 January 1950s. So since 26 January 1950, we are now a democratic country with a parliamentary form of government. Democracy in India is executed through the will of the people. That is, the people in a free and fair elections based on the voting rights of all the adults, irrespective of their gender, irrespective of their economic status, irrespective of their caste or religion. Each citizen of this country can vote in the elections, execute his or her right in the free and fair elections, and that is how the government is formed. Meaning that India gives the right to vote to all the adult citizens. regardless of wealth, regardless of income, regardless of gender, whether it's male or female, regardless of the social status, irrespective of his caste or her caste or religion, irrespective of the race, ethnicity, and political stance. So this is very interesting right, very important right, which people actually got immediately after independence. So India became independent from the British yoke, and all the Indians got this right to vote. Now this, why is it important that to stress that this right to vote is a very crucial achievement? In order to get into this, we need to look at the democracies around the world and see how the right to vote was secured for their citizens. In the first modern democracies like those in United Kingdom or in America, the governments restricted the vote to only the people with property and wealth. This is a very sad part of the history, that when we said that United Kingdom became democratic, or when America adopted the democratic form of government, it was a democracy in a limited sense. That is because though they were democracies, their governments restricted the vote only to some set of peoples. The set of peoples having some property or some wealth, and which almost always meant that a minority of the male population got to vote. So it was not a truly democratic setup, though we would rejoice that they were the modern democracies. So this has to be clearly understood, that the modern democracies of United Kingdom, United States of America, they became democracies in the real sense quite later. I would like to start this discussion with the French Revolution. When people started talking about rights of men, when people started talking about equality and fraternity and liberty, so this has to do with the French Revolution. So 1789 is one of the most significant dates in history, famous for the revolution in France against monarchy. So this is how most of the people now would say that our democracy has roots in French Revolution, because it was that day, that date when the people of France, they revolted against the monarchy, and their cries were for liberty, for equality and fraternity. And this French Revolution, though it didn't last for many years, that led to the removal of the French upper classes. And that also gave the rights to the male people, universal male suffrage, though for a brief period. So you look at 1789 as a milestone in the development of democracy, because it was that struggle against the monarchy which paved the way for democracy, not only in France but also in other parts of the world. This also has to be considered with reference to the very famous book by Thomas Paine, which he penned, called as Rights of Man. He was a British scholar, and Britain then was a monarchy. He came from Britain to France to study and support the French Revolution, and he wrote this pamphlet of Rights of Man, wherein he considered that the ordinary people, they have the right to elect their own government. So this was an important beginning of the talk of democracy. However, as I said, that in France, there was a limited form of democracy for a limited period of time. So only men were allowed to vote, and that too for a limited period of time, because French Revolution did not last for long. And it took about 100 years for the people of France again to get back the voting rights, especially the male community got back their voting rights in 1848. So about 100 years after the French Revolution, the people of France, the male community, got the voting rights, and it took another 100 years for the women to get the voting rights. So look at this. So though the French Revolution talked about liberty, equality, and fraternity, you would see that this was limited for a limited period and only for the limited set of people. Of course, French Revolution did uh, create inspiration among the Americans who had got the democracy and freedom from the Britishers. If you look at the Declaration of American Independence, which was drafted by Jefferson, what it talks about is the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for the citizens of America. Okay, and it said that all men are created equal. So this is also an important declaration. You see that the French Revolution talks about equality. The Declaration of American Independence talks about equality, right? And then 1789, you see that Americans have got independence from Britishers. So this French Revolution created a sort of political debate, okay? And there were two camps, obviously. One was the pro-French camp, and other was the pro-British camp, okay? And what did they debate? Thomas Jefferson, who later became the third president of America, he supported the French Revolution. He supported the ideas of French Revolution. And there was other group called as the Hamiltons. And they reviewed the revolution, French Revolution, with skepticism. Okay, and they wanted to maintain the commercial ties with Great Britain. So these two different groups, they debated a lot when President George Washington was the first president of America. And this sort of debate regarding the ideas of French Revolution and how the French Revolution was to be welcomed or whether it has to be attacked. Okay, that sort of debate actually helped the Americans strengthen their concepts of democracies. Now, in that year, 1789, the Constitution of United States, they granted the states the power to set their voting requirements. You see that United States of America is actually a federal kind of structure where a lot of powers rest with the states. Okay, so those states, they were given the powers to decide who would be voting in their elections, and most of the states limited this right only to the property owning or tax paying white males, not the colored males, only the males, and only that too only the white males. And this was about only 6% of the population. So if you look at the American democracy, though we say that America was democratic in 1789, but it was a democracy in a very, very limited sense, because only about 6% of the population, they had the right to vote in 1789. So 1789 is a period when we are talking about the French Revolution. We are talking about the Americans getting the right to vote and getting their independence from the Britishers. So it took about many, many years up to 1828, where the property restriction went off, and in 1828 presidential elections, it was the first time when the non-property holding white males could vote in vast majority of the states. So look at this. So up to 1828, only the rich people, the people who owned properties, and that too male and that too whites, they were promoting the so-called democracy in America. Okay, so this is a democracy in courts. In 1828, this property restrictions went off, but still it was the whites, and that too the male white, okay, who got the right to vote. So by the end of 1820s, attitudes and state laws has shifted in favor of universal white male suffrage. So now the democracy has widened its scope. So up to 1828, the democracy has widened its scope, but so in short, 1828, as I said, the presidential election was the first in which non-property holding white males could vote. And this was a very limited sort of democracy. We need to agree to this. 1870s, this was when the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution happened. And in that amendment, people did got the democratic rights to vote irrespective of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So this was an important amendment, I would say, which enlarged the voting rights of the Americans and strengthened American democracy. Because now even the Afro-Americans were given the right to vote. But it was up to 1920s that the women were not allowed to vote. And the guarantee for the women to vote came only by the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So you see that if you look at the history of American democracy, though we would say that America got independence and this is the longest serving democracy, but it was a very limited sort of democracy because the right to vote was restricted to very few people, especially the white, especially the male community. So only in 1920 you would see that women also got the right to vote. That too, the non-white women, they were put some restrictions in getting the right to vote. And the Native Americans, they got the voting rights in 1924. You see that. So if you do a survey of this is a very brief survey actually. If you look at the relationship between the voting rights and American democracy, you would see that American democracy is then a very recent phenomenon. Okay, so though we say that America got its independence in 1789, but it took about 1924 for all its people to get the right to vote. Okay, so thus we would say that is the limited democracy which America practiced up to 1924. Same thing about United Kingdom. We in India have adopted the democracy by looking at the democratic governments of United Kingdom, America, and the French Revolution. But as you see, even in England, for example, it was only in 1918 that the people over the age of 21 and women over the age of 30 who had some property, some minimum property, they got the right to vote. Okay, so this was even up to 1980, there was a property qualification, you see. Okay, and not all the men and not all the women were given the equal voting rights. So it took up to 1928 when there was finally the Representation of the People Act, which is also called as Equal Franchise Act. That was the year when we would say that all the people, men and women, over the age of 21, they got the voting rights on equal terms. So it's quite a recent phenomenon. Okay, so 1928 in United Kingdom and 1924 in America. Okay, in India, on the contrary, you would find that all the Indians, irrespective of their caste, religion, race, okay, rich or poor, everybody got the right to vote. Okay, and that was conferred upon them. There was no struggle as such for the people to demand the right to vote because the democratic government of India and the constitution makers, they gave this right as a right or as a gift of the freedom struggle. Okay, and then you see that there was a first general election immediately after India became a republic. Okay, so there were first elections to the Lok Sabha, which is a upper house of the, which is India is a bicameral thing with Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, just as we have a House of Lords and House of Commons. Okay, similarly we have here a Lok Sabha, which is more representative, and Rajya Sabha. So the elections were direct elections happened to this Lok Sabha, and this happened uh, in between 25th October 1951 to 21st Feb 1952, and all the people they got this right to vote. Okay, and this were conducted under the provisions of Indian Constitution. And as I said, Indian Constitution was adopted on 26th November 1949. Okay, and elections to the state legislatures also took place simultaneously. So India this way became the country which had the largest election conducted at that time. So about 489 seats in the Lok Sabha were elected, and about 2,000 candidates competed for this. And democratically, the elections were happened non-violently. So many people, about 45% voter turnout. You see that there was a, though theoretically everybody had got the voting rights, but it was only the more politically aware people who participated in the elections, and they got finally to vote and elect the government. So you see that Indian democracy is a very special kind of democracy, and similar to the democracies which we have around the world. And as I compared it with France, I compared it with United States of America and United Kingdom. Indian democracy is that way. Indians are that way very fortunate because they got the right to vote immediately after their independence, unlike in other countries. Okay, thank you very much.